The wrappings, the ribbons, the stockings, the stuffers, the greenery, the scenery, the comforts, the joy. No one makes Christmas magic the way you can with Joanne. So make your list. It's a sale that comes but once a year. Christmas savings time, now at Joanne, your creative center.
Joanne Stores, or Joanne Fabrics, or just Joanne's, or whatever you want to call them, is, well, frankly, a fabric store for the most part. Fabric and crafts store. This particular retail establishment is in an interesting niche since, well, it's all about crafting, making baskets, or sewing, or knitting, or crocheting, or whatever you want to do. And these sorts of hobbies are actually quite popular among a certain crowd. People like making crafts. It's good for mental health in some cases, or some people even have small businesses centered around homemade crafts. Joanne's is basically an establishment that sells the materials needed to put together whatever you happen to be making. It's an innocent and humble sort of idea. But more recently, Joanne hasn't been doing so hot. Nope, not looking so good. And they aren't shut down yet. But I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, probably not much longer. I mean, they might be under new management and last a few more years, but they've been going downhill really badly. But before we get to that, we'll start at the beginning. Joanne's history is pretty interesting because they had, 6 founders. Yeah, 6. Which is a lot, frankly. Usually with these corporate histories, it's 1 or 2, but not in Joanne's case. The original company was known as Cleveland Fabric Shop, and it was founded in 1943 by German immigrants. Hilda Reich, Berthold Reich, Sigmund Rohrbach, Matilda Rohrbach, Justin Zimmerman, and Alma Zimmerman. All 6 got together and opened the Cleveland Fabric Shop in, well, Cleveland, Ohio, as you might imagine. And they actually did pretty well. Having all these fabrics in a single place for people to come and buy said things was convenient, and they saw some expansion over the years. They did fairly well, and nothing really major happened, to be honest. Like I said, it was a pretty humble establishment, all things considered. Though in 1963, the name was changed to Joanne Fabrics. And contrary to what you might think, the name Joanne is not actually from someone named Joanne. It was a combination of 2 different names from 2 of the founding families, Joan and Jacqueline Ann Joanne. And in 1969, they became a publicly held corporation, traded on the American Stock Exchange, not under the name Joanne Fabrics though, but under the name Fabri-Centers of America. They continued to see growth into a nationwide enterprise over the following decades. The thing about Joann's, especially at the time, is that, yeah, they were a specialty store, but that specialty they were really, really good at. When it came to any kind of crafting, and especially fabrics, well, they had it at a reasonable price. Most of the big box chains didn't specialize, or even really have hardly any selection when it came to what Joann's had. So if you were looking for raw fabrics, well, you almost had to go to a place like Joann's. You couldn't go to Walmart, k-mart, or Target and find that sort of thing at the time, simply because most of them specialized in things like, pre-made clothing, not necessarily crafting. Even in recent times, a lot of the big boxes don't have as wide a selection in this department as Joann's does. Though more on that issue later. By 1994, they had become profitable and wealthy enough to make their first acquisition of a competitor, Cloth World, which was a 342-store Southern company. At the time, Fabri-Centers was already up to 655 stores. Though into the 90s, they weren't without their issues. At face value, they were a humble establishment selling crafts. That's all fun and dandy, but behind the scenes, corporate nonsense. They had to settle a $3.3 million federal charge because they were accused of misleading their own investors back in 1992 by overstating their own earnings before selling securities. The CEO at that time, Alan D. Roscom, who was the grandson of Hilda and Berthold Reich, wound up having to settle a related administrative complaint as well. But, suits gonna be suits, playing fast and loose with investors. It's rude, but hey, it's fine, and I'm sure nothing terrible could possibly go wrong in the future. We'll see. Because to be honest, them misleading investors, in retrospect, is kind of silly because they really didn't have to do that. Throughout the 90s, they were making a lot of money. Like, why are you lying about it? This wasn't like an Enron situation where they had to lie in order to make themselves look good to keep their investors around. No, Joann's was fine at the time, so I have no idea what they were doing. Anyway, in 1998, they spent more of their wealth and acquired House of Fabrics, an establishment that some of my older audience may remember as something like Fabricland, Fabric King, or Sofro Fabrics. It was all the same, and Joann's got a hold of that. That same year, they altered their name yet again to Joann Stores Incorporated, and every single store under their roster was rebranded to Joann Fabrics. However, into the late 2000s and into the 2010s, Joann started going through a rocky situation. Part of the problem was the rise of the internet. A lot of crafters just weren't going to the store to get what they needed. An experienced crafter knows what materials they want anyway. They don't necessarily need to browse and feel, So they could go to, say, Amazon to get crafts. Now, Joann's did wind up having an online shop in order to capitalize on the internet, and that's good, but they still had to worry about their brick and mortar store, and it was starting to become a bit of a problem for them. Plus, the other big box chains had slightly expanded their offerings in terms of the crafting department. Rookie hobbyists who might be interested in getting into crafting but weren't sure could now go browse doing their regular shopping at, say, Walmart without having to make an extra trip to a specialty store like Joann's. These were hurdles that were affecting a lot of different companies, and to be honest, mostly the specialty stores, like Joann's is. On March 23, 2010, they announced their plans to sell out to a private equity firm known as Leonard Green for $1.6 billion, which is always a great thing to hear from any company. Every time I hear private equity firm, I'm like, oh no. Once you get those guys in the room, they're not here to run a business, they're here to make a profit. And you might think those two things would go hand in hand, and logistically they should, but when private equity firms look to make a profit, they're looking to make a profit for themselves, not necessarily the overall company, and that's kind of the problem. Private equity has run a lot of different brands into the ground over the years, sometimes on purpose simply to strip the assets and then run away with the money. The issue is that generally there's nothing illegal about doing that, though it does hurt the consumer as well as the employees of said company. The deal did go through, and Joann's would be delisted from the stock exchange in March of 2011. Their acting CEO at that time was Darrell Webb, and he would resign that same month, with a man named Travis Smith being promoted into the role. But he would only last 3 years. He resigned in March of 2014, with the company's CFO, Jim Kerr, agreeing to become acting CEO until a replacement was found. Another year passed, and in March of 2015, man, they like doing stuff in March, I know, but hey, whatever, a woman named Jill Soltau was named president CEO and a member of the company board of directors. And they started, which is annoying for me because now I have to talk about it, getting involved in politics, because of course they did. Why do you do this to me? I'm here to talk about economics, and I know people like to mix the two together, but they don't always go hand in hand, but here you have brought it up. Because Soltau and the company, under her leadership, was staunchly opposed to President Trump, particularly his tariffs against a lot of, for example, Chinese manufacturers. Joann had a lot of foreign suppliers, and it wasn't that they didn't want to use American manufacturers, but they didn't feel that the American manufacturers met their quality standards, which is hilarious, but whatever, or volume needs. And the latter I definitely believe. I mean, we're talking about a proper, regulated American manufacturing establishment trying to compete with a Chinese sweatshop. I mean, okay, one of these is going to produce more than the other. Is it going to be on the backs of hard labor? Yes, but they are going to produce more. She would wind up being at a meeting with the Trump administration where they explained that the tariff was going to raise consumer prices as well as hurt their own businesses and other businesses. But Trump is Trump, and regardless of what you think of him, he's not really the kind of guy that backs down whenever he sets his mind to doing something. So in order to cope, Joanne would wind up slightly rebranding from Joanne Stores to just Joanne, which, okay, that's not helping, but okay. But they were moving outside of fabrics. They had specialized in fabrics over the years, but they decided to start adding to their inventory, incorporating other crafting things for stuff like baskets or painting or whatever you want to craft. Joanne was going to have it. And expanding their inventory was probably a good idea. It would let them have just more stuff and be more attractive to different kinds of crafting, not just the fabric end of things. That same month, when the rebranding went through, Seltal actually left, and the following year she'd be replaced by a man named Wade McKellen, who did have experience as an executive. He had worked at Procter & Gamble as well as Walgreens. Oh no! It's time for the virus! And interestingly, Joanne's had a weird, relationship with COVID. See, they were doing really bad prior to the pandemic. They lost $546.6 million in the 2019 fiscal year. So over $500 million. That's great. That's wonderful. It's just awful. But by the end of 2020, they made $210.9 million. As well as adding 9 million new customers. What? How did they do that? Well, think about it. With the stay-at-home orders, people had a lot of downtime. And one of the things people did to, well, kill time that they suddenly had was crafting. And many people picked up new hobbies during the pandemic just to quell the boredom associated with it. Joanne was ripe to capitalize on this by, well, offering what they'd always offered. And they had their online store. It wasn't like anyone had to go out to shop there. It meant they could make sales, even during a time when most businesses were starting to struggle, simply because while they weren't an essential good necessarily, many people found solace in being able to create something homemade while they had literally nothing else they could be doing. Though this didn't happen without criticism. The Joannes in particular received a lot of attention because they insisted on keeping many of their stores open, even though many didn't consider them, well, an essential establishment during the pandemic. And I'm sure a lot of you will debate about the justification of that, but what I don't think is up for debate is that the other thing they did is they refused to pay sick leave for employees affected by COVID, which, yo, listen, come on. Most companies do that with pretty much any sickness. They defended themselves in a statement by claiming that their free mask kits helped local hospitals, which allowed the stores to be considered essential business. And these free mask kits are essentially ways to home make your own mask. That sounds good. Problem is the homemade masks weren't up to actual medical standards. They didn't actually do anything when it came to what the masks were for, so they weren't helpful. Most hospitals rejected them, and Michigan's governor forced stores in her state to close down after they sent the government a letter requesting not to be included in the stay-at-home orders. Whitmer pointed out, as I did, that even if someone wanted to shop at Joann's, the materials used to create the masks were also available in Joann's own online store that could be shopped at without in-person contact, which is exactly what they were trying to avoid. The other bit of controversy, and this is just kind of scummy to be honest, these free mask kits were later examined closely, and it was discovered that the materials used in them were actually remnants. Remnants, in this context, basically refers to extra bits of fabric that are often thrown to the side or even thrown away while you're putting together, say, well, any project that involves fabric, to be honest. It's not unusual for a sewer, knitter, crocheter, whatever it may be, to have extra fabric that they had to cut away in order to make the shape they want. Remnants are either thrown out, recycled, or, in Joann's case, they were generally sold at a discount, meaning that Joann was basically creating their free mask kits from, well, extra scraps. Granted, the free mask kits were, well, free. They were still giving them away, but it wasn't nearly as generous as Joann was leading on. And as I said, they weren't actually up to medical standards, so... I don't know. But because of the pandemic and because a lot of people were crafting at the time, Joann's wound up making a profit during those years. But as soon as the restrictions were relaxed, that all changed again. They did get pretty daring and went public on the NASDAQ market on March 16th of 2021 under the ticker symbol Joan. Leonard Green and Partners still owned a majority stake in the company, which meant they still could nominate up to 5 directors, but going public did offer a much-needed injection of cash from outside investors. But this did not help. Without the restrictions, most people went back to doing what they otherwise would have, and that wasn't necessarily crafting, or if they were, the pandemic had taught a lot of crafters that they could in fact get what they needed online, and they didn't always have to get it through Joann. They could go to, well, a lot of other websites that also sold the same thing. They started spiraling fast, real fast. In September of 2023, they announced they would start layoffs within their corporate headquarters, though at the time, they didn't specify the exact number of workers they planned on laying off. Just the following month, both Filch Ratings and Credit Risk Monitor reported that Joann looked like they were nearing a potential Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing. That same month, Joann received a delisting notice from NASDAQ because their stock price had fallen below $1 per share. NASDAQ didn't entertain penny stocks, which was basically what Joann was starting to become despite being a nationwide operation. They made it clear that unless they were able to get their shares back up to at least $1, they were gonna be delisted. They stumbled along for a few more months, but in March of 2024, the inevitable was announced. They were preparing to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protections as part of a deal that would allow them to sell off some of their assets to lenders and shed crippling debt that was holding them down. It wasn't just poor sales, that was the main thing, but the debt was a serious problem they had to address, and they just weren't able to do it. They officially filed on March 18th of that year, and they pushed forward plans to cut $500 million in debt, and they would also move to be a privately held company after the restructuring plans. And interestingly, the initial strategy was actually to avoid any more layoffs. They didn't want any of their employees or stores affected by this, so at first, nothing was closed down and no one was fired. But since they were going to go private, and they'd already been warned, they would be delisted from NASDAQ on April 9th. On April 25th, a federal judge would approve Joann's bankruptcy reorganization plan. They expected to exit bankruptcy and become a privately held company within just a few more days, again, without shutting anything down or laying anybody off. But that didn't go according to plan at all. They did exit from that bankruptcy and seemed to carry forward, but none of their restructuring actually addressed the core problem, which was no one is shopping with you. Again, a lot of crafters just weren't going to Joann's. For one thing, the market for crafters, just in general, has kind of fallen off compared to when Joann's was founded. A lot of today's youth, frankly, most of them just don't know how to sew or knit or do anything like this. It was mostly for older people, and older people are old and, well, will pass away. Basically, a lot of their customers were slowly starting to, well, die. And among the younger generations, the crafters that were there weren't necessarily going to Joann's for the fabric. They were getting their stuff online. And, yeah, they did get that boon as a result of COVID, the exact opposite of what you would expect, but that was only because people literally had nothing better to do. Once the restrictions were lifted, a lot of people didn't pick up the crafting hobby again, as unfortunate as it is. I'm not saying I agree with this. I think crafting is important. Heck, I know how to sew. But the point is that most people, a lot of young people, just flat out weren't going to Joann's because they had no need to. Whether it be because they didn't craft anything, they weren't making anything, or if it was a hobby they did, they just shopped online and waited for it to come in the mail. This is a situation that I don't know if Joann's can necessarily come back from, just because the market has completely shifted against this type of specialty store. There just aren't enough people anymore that are going to Joann's on a daily basis to get the things that they sell. I actually think it was a mistake during their first bankruptcy not to shrink themselves. The plan was idealistic, and, in a perfect world I agree. Don't lay anyone off, don't shut any stores down. That's great on principle. But from a sheer math perspective, it was probably a bad friggin' call, because there just aren't enough customers to support the amount of stores they have. There are over 800 locations across 49 states. You can't tell me that Joann's is that in demand anymore. They just aren't. I hate to say it, but it's true. In order to survive, they're gonna have to shrink down and only keep around their most profitable locations, the ones that are actually making money. Had they done that in the first place, maybe start selling stuff that people actually do want to buy, even get into other hobbies beyond just crafting, who knows? But they didn't do any of that. And as a result, on January 15th, 2025, which as I'm recording this is just 15 days ago, they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protections again, twice in less than a year. They blame declining sales as a contribution to this, which I absolutely believe, and as it stands, they plan on remaining open throughout this process to shed another $500 million worth of debt. How much debt did you have? You might be saying, well, they aren't closed yet. They're in protections again. That means they aren't liquidating. True. Also, I've never heard of a company filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy twice within a year and surviving for any length of time after it. Even if they can figure it out, it's a bad, bad look. At the moment, though, it seems like what they're trying to do is sell. The plan, it seems, is to do, well, honestly, exactly the same thing that Big Lots did, which is selling a bunch of their assets to new management, and hope that they can fix the problem. And when I say exactly the same thing Big Lots is doing, I mean quite literally, because at the moment, the stalking horse bidder to acquire Joann is Gordon Brothers Retail Partners, LLC, the same guys that had bought a bunch of Big Lots stores. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're guaranteed to be sold to them. Others can bid, so it's impossible to say right now exactly what's going to happen, but it looks like either way, they're going to be under new management, new ownership, but as it stands right now, as of January 30th, 2025, they still plan on staying open. In my personal opinion, Joann's needs to downsize. Now. They just don't have the customer base they once did. It is not physically possible. It's not mathematically possible for them to get enough income to continue supporting all their locations. They have to close some of them. And it does look like they are finally starting to do that. So far, they're closing 6 different locations. One in Maryland, one in Massachusetts, one in New York, one in North Carolina, one in Iowa, and one in Pennsylvania. Now, I don't think that's nearly enough. Because they have over 800. You can't tell me closing 6 of them is going to fix their problems. There's no way. You have $500 million in debt. Again, like, you have to close more than that. But right now, that's where we're looking. I personally predict more closures in the future. And in my personal opinion, they're going to have to shift their focus a little bit. I still think they should sell the fabric as their core business model, but they're definitely going to have to start offering other things if they're going to remain competitive. But at the moment, the vast majority of Joann locations are staying open and are still operating normally, as well as the online shop. So you can still shop with them at the moment if you want, but unless they make some major changes, I can't see them surviving much longer. They're just hemorrhaging money all over the place. Yeah, they'll be under new management, but there's only so much new management can do if people aren't shopping there. It's as simple as that. So, it remains to be seen how it's going to be handled. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.